Chapter 25. Keep your friends close. Back at 221B a while later. Amelia stopped into the living room of 221B, Sherlock right behind her, both of their gazes falling upon Mrs. Hudson, who sat in a chair before the fireplace. The CI man who had led the raid on Irene's house, Nielsen, holding a pistol to the back of Miss Hudson's head. "Oh, Amelia, Sherlock," Miss Hudson sobbed. "Don't snivel, Miss Hudson," Sherlock said briskly. "It will do nothing to impede the flight of a bullet. But what a tender world that would be." He strolled towards her, trying to contain his smile as Amelia was patted down by another CI agent for weapons. The man retrieved several knives and 3 pistols. "Oh, please. Sorry, Sherlock," Mrs. Hudson said, continuing her tears. "I believe you have something we want, Mr. Holmes, Miss Watson," Neil said sternly, eyeing the pile of Amelia's weapons on the table. Amelia walked over to Mrs. Hudson, patting her arm kindly. Mrs. Hudson's eyes flickered up to meet Amelia's. Mrs. Hudson nodded slightly. A small rectangular object of hard plastic was pressed into Amelia's hand, which she immediately closed her fingers around. Amelia backed away, discreetly tucking the item into her bra. "Then why don't you ask for it?" Amelia said rudely, falling to the ground as the CI agent guarding her hit her across her face with the butt of his gun. She gasped as he yanked her up by her hair, clawing at her assailant's hand in a desperate attempt to get him to let her go. Sherlock stiffened as if he tried not to go and defend Amelia, choosing to focus on Mrs. Hudson instead. He pulled back the sleeve of Mrs. Hudson's right hand, cringing at the bruises that littered the pale skin there. "Sure," Mrs. Hudson said weakly. "I've been asking this one," Nielsen said to Sherlock as Amelia's attacker pressed his pistol against her temple. "She doesn't seem to know anything." Sherlock ignored Amelia's whimpers, his eyes locking on the tear on the right shoulder of Mrs. Hudson's cardigan. "But you know what I'm asking for, don't you, Mr. Holmes?" Amelia stepped on her attacker's foot, the crack of several bones sounding as Sherlock looked to the cut on Mrs. Hudson's right cheek. A small smile tugged at the corner of Sherlock's mouth despite the grave situation, proud of Amelia's actions. Sherlock's gaze flicked to Nielsen, seeing the ring on his right third finger, blood-stained with silver. Sherlock raised his head, eyeing Nielsen. He rapidly found the weakest points of the human body where, if damaged, would cause the most amount of pain, already coming up with a plan as how he could damage all of them at once. Head, carotid artery. Skull, eyes, arms and chest, artery, lungs, ribs. I believe I do," Sherlock said, releasing Mrs. Hudson's hand. He straightened, placing his hands behind his back. "Oh, please, Sherlock," Amelia begged quietly. "First," he said to Nielsen, "get rid of your boys." "Why?" Nielsen asked. "I dislike being outnumbered," Sherlock answered simply. "It makes for too much stupid in the room." Nielsen hesitated. "You two," he ordered his men. "Go to the car." "Then get into the car and drive away," Amelia ordered as the man guarding her stepped away, then turned to Nielsen. "Don't try to tick us. You know who we are. It doesn't work." Once the two men had left, Amelia folded her arms over her chest, the demanding nature of being a head agent for an MI6 kicking in. "Next, you can stop pointing that gun at me." "So one of you can point a gun at me?" Nielsen questioned. "I'm unarmed," Sherlock reassured, taking a step back and holding his arms out. "Mind if I check?" Nielsen asked. "Oh, I insist," Sherlock said with a small smile as Nielsen came up behind him, patting the consulting detective down. Amelia snickered as Sherlock meekly kept holding his arms out. Sherlock rolled his eyes dramatically, reaching behind his back and taking out a canned bottle of sanitizer, spraying it into Nielsen's eyes and headbutting him as Nielsen screamed, effectively knocking him down. "Moron," Sherlock said triumphantly, tossing the can into the air and slamming it down onto the table. He hurried over to Amelia, who waved him off dismissively, assuring him that she was fine. Sherlock nodded, going over to Mrs. Hudson. "Oh, thank you," Mrs. Hudson said thankfully. "You're all right now." "You're all right," Sherlock said, kindly stroking the side of her face. "Yes," Mrs. Hudson said, relieved. Amelia kicked Nielsen's limp side, smirking. She ran a hand through her hair, massaging the stinging roots. "Do me a favor," she said, turning to Sherlock, seeing his murderous gaze, "and don't kill him. If he really is CIA, Mycroft will never let me live his death down." She grabbed a piece of paper, scribbling down a note, which read, "Crime in process. Please disturb." She taped it to the outside door before firmly shutting it behind her, heading back upstairs. She heaved Nielsen's form onto the chair Mrs. Hudson had been occupying, grabbing a roll of silver duct tape from the kitchen. She looped it twice around his ankles, securing him to the chair, and thrice around his wrists, ensuring that he wouldn't be able to attack them. And just for good measures, she gagged him with another strip of duct tape. "What's going on?" John asked as he came up the stairs, stopping shortly at the sight of the helplessly bound and now conscious Nielsen. Nielsen's nose had broken when Sherlock had headbutted him, blood drying in a drip-like pattern over his lips and chin. Mrs. Hudson sat along with Amelia on the sofa, Sherlock sitting in a chair nearby with Nielsen's pistol aimed at the CIA agent. His phone pressed to his ear. Amelia's face had begun to show bruising from where Nielsen's men had hit her with a gun, the tender flesh of her cheek throbbing painfully. "Jeez," said John, "what the hell is happening?" "We've been attacked by an American," Amelia informed, gesturing to herself and Mrs. Hudson before waving at Sherlock. "He's restoring balance to the universe, and I'm waiting for the kettle to boil." "Oh, Mrs. Hudson, Ames, my God, are you all right?" John said as he sat down beside his landlady and his sister, glaring at Nielsen all the while. "Jesus, what have they done to you?" Oh, Mrs. Hudson said as she broke into tears, covering her face with her hands. "I'm just being so silly." "No, no," John said as he held her close, his eyes on Amelia, who had stood, hearing the scream-like whistle of the kettle, signifying that the water had boiled. Sherlock got to his feet as well, holding the phone down to his ear while keeping the gun aimed at Nielsen. "Downstairs," he said to John. "Take her downstairs and look after her." "All right," John said as he gently guided Mrs. Hudson to 221A. "It's all right. I'll have a look at that." I'm fine, Mrs. Hudson tittered reassuringly. "Amelia, too," Sherlock said, waving Amelia out of the room with Nielsen's gun. "Hey, that's likely to happen," Amelia scuffed as she sat her tea to his feet. "Come on." She leaned against the doorframe, her arms folded over her chest, one foot pressed against the wood of the frame. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" John asked Sherlock as Mrs. Hudson headed down the stairs. "I expect so," Sherlock said. "Now go, both of you." Amelia let out a huff, glaring at Sherlock in fury, Sherlock returning the look. Realizing that it'd be impossible to win an argument with Sherlock, the two broke their glaring match and turned their murderous gazes to Nielsen. Amelia turned away, laughing hollowly. She had seen the glimmer of hope in Nielsen's eyes, as if he doubted Sherlock would actually hurt him. But Amelia knew otherwise. Sherlock was the type who'd hold a grudge, and Nielsen had hurt the two women Sherlock cared about most. "Lestrade," Sherlock said, well aware that Amelia was listening to his conversation. "We've had a break-in at Baker Street. Send your least irritating officers and an ambulance." He took his eyes off of Nielsen, walking to the table and laying the pistol down. "Dear God," Lestrade said in shock. "Are you guys hurt?" "Oh, no, we're fine," Sherlock said quickly, seeing Amelia walk down the stairs out of a corner of his eye. "No, it's the burglar. He's got himself rather badly injured." "Badly injured?" Lestrade exclaimed. "Oh, a few broken ribs, fractured skull, suspected punctured lung," Sherlock replied, glancing over his shoulder at Nielsen, whose expression had become wary. "He fell out a window," Sherlock finished as he hung up, still looking at Nielsen. Emerald eyes full of hatred. Downstairs, 221A's kitchen. Amelia perched on Mrs. Hudson's kitchen counter, swinging her legs back and forth. John was gently applying an ointment to the cut on Mrs. Hudson's cheek. He hadn't bothered to tend to Amelia's wounds, as she'd only waved him off, insisting she was fine. "Ooh, it stings," Miss Hudson said, flinching, as John continued to apply the antiseptic. Antiseptic. John nodded once sympathetically, the trio jumping as the large, black shape plummeted past the window of the kitchen, landing with a loud crash on the outside the flat. "Ooh," said Mrs. Hudson. "That was right on my bins." Amelia grinned from ear to ear as she heard a manly groan come from outside, deducting that it was Nielsen's. She couldn't help but feel flattered that Sherlock was protective of her and wanted to ensure her safety. The sun's last rays were peeking out over the horizon as Lestrade and his ambulance arrived. Sherlock stood along with Amelia and Lestrade outside of Speedy's cafe. Sherlock's arm wrapped around Amelia's waist. She leaned into his side, her ankle still throbbing in pain and feeling a bit dizzy from being hit in the head with the gun. She had waved the medics off when they had tried to check for her for a concussion that lit the shock blanket they had given her. "And exactly how many times did he fall out of the window?" Lestrade questioned Sherlock, wrinkling his nose at the pungent odor of smoke lingering in the air. It's all a bit of a blur, Detective Inspector. I lost count, Sherlock said with a smirk, placing a large kiss on Amelia's forehead, ignoring or completely oblivious to the shocked look Lestrade gave him. Lestrade shook his head, muttering something about owing Mycroft a tenner as he walked away. Amelia turned to Sherlock, one eyebrow cocked. They were betting on us? One of the few pastimes Mycroft actually enjoys, Sherlock replied cryptically, leading Amelia back inside. She'll have to sleep upstairs in our flat tonight, John informed as Amelia and Sherlock walked into Miss Hudson's kitchen. We need to look after her. He cocked his head at Sherlock's arm around Amelia's waist, but didn't comment otherwise. No, Mrs. Hudson protested. Of course, Amelia said to John, both agreeing and disagreeing with the statement. But she's fine. No, she's not. Neither is she, John said insistently, gesturing to his sister and Mrs. Hudson. Look at them. His eyes followed Sherlock as he reached into the fridge and pulled out a mince pie. They've got to take some time away from Baker Street. They can go and stay with Mrs. Hudson's sister. Doctor's orders. Sherlock kicked the door of the fridge shut as he bit into the mince pie, frowning at John condescendingly. Don't be absurd. They're in shock, for God's sake, and all over some bloody stupid camera phone, John said. Where is it, anyways? Sherlock wiped the crumbs from his mouth, looking to Miss Hudson, then to Amelia. Safest place I know, he answered. Amelia pulled it out from her bra, John politely looking away, and handing the phone to Sherlock with a coy smile. Honestly, sure, you don't leave these things lying around in the house, she glared at John. And for the record, I'm not in shock. I lit the shock blanket on fire when they gave it to me. Blithering idiots. You left it in the pocket of your second-best dressing gown, you clot, Mrs. Hudson agreed with a small laugh. I managed to sneak it out when they thought I was having a cry. Sherlock tossed it in the air, catching it and putting it into the corner of his coat. Thank you, both of you. He looked at John. Shame on you, John Watson. Shame on me, John exclaimed, his protest shooting a look at his sister for help, who merely shrugged, agreeing with Sherlock. Mrs. Hudson and Amelia leave Baker Street, Sherlock said as he put an arm around Mrs. Hudson and Amelia's shoulders, pulling them close. England would fall. The two women laughed, Amelia stroking his hand. John smiled more to himself than the others. Look at him, John thought as he glanced at Sherlock. The love-struck fool. A few days later, Amelia stifled her yawn, pushing her chair away from her new microscope, which was currently sitting on the kitchen table. She'd gotten it for Christmas, despite clearly expressing that she didn't want or need anything. Despite this, everyone save for Sherlock had pitched in and bought Amelia this microscope she was currently working with. Although Amelia wasn't too sure Sherlock hadn't gotten her anything, as she'd found a receipt tucked in his coat's inner pocket, all information crossed out with a black permanent marker, then dipped in what seemed to be a diluted form of hydrochloric acid. That paranoid twat, Amelia thought with a smile, always so perceptive of everyone and everything but himself. Amelia knew that if she really wanted to, she'd be able to find out what was on this receipt, but decided to give Sherlock a bit of space. The two had tried to conceal their relationship from the rest of the world, Sherlock insisting that he didn't want Amelia to get too much publicity, as she was, after all, a secret agent. Amelia would have come up with a new alibi soon. Perhaps I could be Sherlock's assistant. No one would make a deal about that, she supposed, since I spent all my time with him anyways. It was currently New Year's Eve. Nothing much had happened after the incident with Sherlock pushing Nielsen out the window. Sherlock had gotten increasingly bored over the course of the past few days, resorting to taking the cases Mycroft had offered him, which worked out well to his advantage since it technically classified as work. Amelia was able to join him on his escapades. Where is it now? John asked Sherlock, breaking Amelia out of her thoughts. He referred to the camera phone Amelia and Sherlock had just returned from hiding half an hour before, although they'd never tell where they had hidden it. Where no one will look, Sherlock replied. And don't worry, it isn't in my bra, Amelia said with a smirk, as Sherlock walked over to the window and picked up his violin. I really didn't need that image in my mind, Ames, John grimaced. You know, whatever's on that phone is more than just pictures. Yes, Amelia agreed, taking a seat in her chair, absent-mindedly flipping through today's newspaper. It is. She glanced at Sherlock, who was tuning his violin. She bit her lip, a thought nagging at her. So she's alive, then. How are we feeling about that? She flirted with both of us, after all. John nearly spit out his drink as Big Ben told 12, Sherlock pulling in a sharp breath at Amelia's remark. Happy New Year, Watsons, he said softly. Do you think you'll be seeing her again? Amelia questioned. As Sherlock turned around, picking up his bow and flipping it in the air, catching it, he began to play auld lang syne, shooting Amelia a pointed look. Fine, be stubborn. I'm not even here. Amelia raised her hands up in mock surrender, taking out her phone and pulling up her conversation with Moriarty. Happy New Year, AW. P.S. Do me a favor and make your resolution not to kill anyone this year. It was less than 3 seconds before he replied. I suppose I could say the same to you, J.M. Don't even get me started, James. A.W. There was a long pause before he replied to Amelia's text. Stay safe, my dearest Amelia. J.M. Meaning, A.W. Keep your friends close, my dear, and your enemies closer. Make of that what you will. Happy New Year, J.M. Amelia set down her phone, James's words running through her head. She looked over her shoulder and out the window at the white snow dusting the city, letting out a breath from between her teeth. It's going to be a long year. Chapter 26. A Client in the Bedroom. The next day, St. Bartholomew's Hospital lab. Sherlock could tell that something was troubling Amelia by the way she frantically tapped the notes to track and fields running up the hill on her knee. He only knew the song because Amelia once said it was one of her favorite songs, and Sherlock had spent the whole day trying to find the sheet music for it. He played it to her every time she turned down a field mission, knowing she desperately wanted to go, but chose not to because she needed to stay safe for Sherlock's sake. Playing the song for her was a way for making for all the trouble that Amelia had gone through for him. You okay? Molly asked Amelia, cocking her head. Amelia nodded in response. Molly had, surprisingly, taken the news of Amelia and Sherlock's relationship well, seeing how the two were a perfect match for each other. In Molly's humble opinion, she thought that Sherlock needed Amelia as much as Amelia needed Sherlock. Sherlock kept Amelia grounded, stopping her from being too rash and jumping straight into the line of fire. She kept her attitude in check with a single glare, and teased her to keep her focus. Her temper was wildfire, quick to ignite and impossibly difficult to put out, and Sherlock was the only person who could calm her, somehow knowing the right words to say and how to say them. Amelia, on the other hand, taught Sherlock everything she knew. She taught him how to use others' words to his advantage, how to anticipate an attack before it happened, how to read the person's body language to determine whether or not they're telling the truth. But most important of all, she taught him how to be human. Sherlock sighed in exasperation as he examined the X-ray of Irene's phone on a computer screen, seeing 4 small round black areas, one in each corner of the phone. Molly came up behind him. Is that a phone? It's a camera phone, Amelia answered for Sherlock, ignoring his dark look as she hopped onto the bench, littered with toxins that could, no doubt, severely injure her if she came in contact with them. Thankfully, Amelia's MI6 training had made her very agile, coordinated, and well aware of surroundings, which meant the likelihood of her knocking one of the irrelium flasks over was next to zero. And you're X-raying it? Molly continued questioning suspiciously. Yes, I am, Sherlock confirmed. Whose phone is it? Molly said, intrigued. A woman, Sherlock replied. Your girlfriend? Molly looked to Amelia with a confused look. She laughed. You think it's my phone because he's X-raying it? It's actually a woman MI6's had an eye on for a while, not mine. Well, Molly said, tittering at her mistake, we all do silly things. Yes, Sherlock said very suddenly, sounding inspired. He looked round to Molly, his eyes lighting up. They do, don't they? Fairly silly. Both Amelia and Molly looked at him in confusion as he jumped to his feet, retrieved the phone out of the X-ray machine he'd been using, completely ignoring the large caution sign saying not to do that, holding up the phone. She sent this to my address, and she loves to play games. She does, Molly said. Highly trained spy, Amelia informed Molly, keeping in mind what she was allowed to disclose to civilians, as if she couldn't persuade people to keep their mouths shut. Of course she does. That's why it took so long for us to catch up to her. Molly shook her head tiredly. Amelia had told Molly about her occupation at Christmas, figuring it was something that Molly should know, given the fact of how much time they spent together. Sherlock pulled up the lock stream, typing in, I am 221B locked. The phone beeped warningly once again, a message reading, wrong passcode. 2 attempts remaining, showing up on the screen. He sighed in exasperation, sitting down again. That was, Amelia said slowly. Well, I'm not quite sure what to say. That was disappointing. Shut up, Sherlock grumbled in frustration. Many days later, Sherlock, Amelia, and John returned to 221B to see Mycroft and Lestrade sitting in their living room, drinking from a pot of tea that had not been there when the trio had left. Amelia said uncertainly as she pulled off her coat and scarf, hanging them on the coat rack. Hello? Miss Watson, Mycroft greeted. Do join us. For God's sake, Mycroft, Amelia said, glaring at her colleague in anger. If you get to call me Miss Watson or Agent Watson, I will start calling you Mike at work. She eyed Mycroft threatening. And now make sure that's what the others call you, too. Mycroft grimaced at his nickname, shooting a dark look at his younger brother as he stifled a laugh. Grow up. This isn't funny. Sherlock shrugged. Of course it is, Mike. I do hope you're pleased, Mycroft said, turning to Amelia, who's now sitting in her usual spot. Trust me, Amelia said, shooting a wink at Mycroft. I am. She turned to Lestrade. So, why did he drag you here? I assume you didn't come of your own free will. Lestrade gulped, looking to Mycroft for permission to speak, which was the first clue that something serious was up. Mycroft waved him off dismissively. Lestrade looked back at Sherlock and Amelia and John. There's been a suicide. Sincerest apologies, but what can we do about it? Sherlock said sharply. That's the door. You can escape yourselves out. Sherlock, do behave, Mycroft said tiredly. Yes, sure, do, agreed with a nod. She shifted positions so she could see Lestrade better. You wouldn't be here if it was just a suicide. There's something more. Her eyes flicked to Mycroft, especially since Mycroft bothered to get out of his office to escort you here. I'm sure he was more than willing to leave, Sherlock said under his breath, then in a louder voice. How's the new diet and the exercise suiting you? Fine, Mycroft stressed with narrowed eyes.
I'll talk to mac and cheese for dinner if you're going to be home.
Okay.
Are you home?
After work.
Okay.
You see, Lestrade began, sounding nervous. He was a government official here on a business trip. He's been receiving death threats for a while. We found his body hung from the ceiling of the Parliament building. Ooh, Amelia said with a sly grin. I would have paid to see their faces. She cocked her head. Who was he? She paused, glancing at Mycroft. Oh, that's why you're here. To make sure Lestrade doesn't say anything he doesn't. He was a Japanese ambassador, Lestrade answered. Apparently, I'm not cleared to know much more. Japanese ambassador, Sherlock mused, repeating the two words over and over again in various tones as he drummed his finger on his chin. Japanese. That's enough, Sherlock, Amelia said sternly. All color drained from her face. She looked to Mycroft. He's dead, really? Afraid so, my dear. Mycroft nodded. Amelia cringed at the last two words, as Moriarty called her that often. If there was one thing she didn't want to do, it was associate Moriarty with Mycroft. Well, her subconscious said, their names share an M and an O and an R, a T and a Y. Amelia mentally stopped herself. I'm sorry, John interrupted, but who the hell are we talking about? And what the hell happened to him? Long story short, Amelia answered hollowly. Teru Fukuyama, a Japanese ambassador, was found hanging in the Parliament ceiling after receiving death threats. People are saying suicide, but they want us to confirm whether or not it's true, which it is obviously not. Teru Fukuyama, John repeated. The guy that was in charge of all the hurricane and tsunami cleanup and rescue in Asia? Yes, him, Amelia nodded. Pity. I like him. She turned to Mycroft. Of course we'll take the case. Mycroft blinked. That was a remarkably quick decision. Yes, well, Amelia said, facing Sherlock, if he doesn't get a case soon, he's going to hang himself from the Parliament ceiling. Amelia looked up at Teru Fukuyama's body hanging from the ceiling, pulling out on a pair of latex gloves. She spun on her heel to look at Sherlock. The bruising around the neck look off to you? Hard to tell at this distance, Sherlock said quietly. Amelia clapped her hands, ordering several forensic officers milling about. We need the body photographed, then taken down. Have it moved to St. Bart's in an hour. We'll need to conduct a few experiments there. Just who do you think you are, bossing us around like that? A bald man demanded fiercely. Amelia Laura Watson, National Security Advisor, who can arrange to have you killed right here, right now, and make it completely legal. So I just you hurry your fat ass up and get to work, Amelia snapped, everyone falling silent at her announcement. Understood. Yes, ma'am, the bald man stuttered. Don't worry, John said reassuringly. She won't actually have you killed. Want to bet? Amelia growled. Amelia, calm down. Bite me, John. She flipped her head over her shoulders, marching to the side of the room, and expecting the floor for something to do. She remained there until Teru's body had been lowered by cutting the rope, specifically not the not the knotted part, then hurried over to Charlotte's side. Her binocular glass was already out. She crouched down, her vision amplified 200 times. She pointed out the bruising around Taru's neck to Sherlock, which was quite difficult as the bruises were partly obscured by thick rope. See these? They're too pale. There wasn't enough blood moving when they were made. Post-mortem injuries, already a sign of murder. Post-mortem? The same bald guide from earlier said nervously. What does that mean? Post means after, and mortem in Latin means death, Amelia said sharply. Figure it out. You mean them bruises was made after he were dead? The bald guide asked. No, Amelia said, aggravated with the man's English. Those bruises were made after he was dead. Yes, they were, which would be quite difficult if he committed suicide. Amelia picked up the length rope, holding the knot in her hand. Sherlock, would you like to tackle this one? He arched an eyebrow at her language, but began rattling off deductions about the knot. This rope, standard fishing rope, made of twine, I'd say. The knot here, it's quite complicated and precise, therefore small, delicate hands, probably female. To make his point, he bent down and lifted Terifugma's large hands, obviously not his own. So either had someone help him with the rope, highly unlikely, as most people would report someone trying to hang themselves, or someone else killed him and then hung him, seemed like he'd committed suicide, covering up their tracks. There's dry blood on the back of his hand, faint but still obviously there. Your head wouldn't bleed if you tried to hang yourself. Someone was obviously trying to wipe it off, with a piece of cotton fabric probably. There's also blood under the nails. Where would he get that? Most likely from clawing at someone who is attacking him. Self-defense at its core. Funny how humans resort to animalistic defense methods in time of danger. He also broke a nose. Did no one else notice? The blood has once again been wiped away, and the nose had been reset. But it's distinctively there. Now, there is nothing to break your nose on, so he must have gotten it from the attacker. From the size of the fracture and the pressure of the nose, I'd say the attacker was definitely a woman, about 5 foot. A woman who knew what she was doing. A woman who'd done this many times before. Probably for her job. A bodyguard or... Sherlock trailed off, turning to face Amelia. You think this is me? Amelia said in shock. Seriously, I have a bit more class than this. At least I'd make an effort to cover this up. This cover-up is piss-poor at best. What do you mean? The bald guy demanded. Isn't it obvious? Amelia said quizzically. Everyone giving her a blank stare. Oh, Sherlock drawled, finally figuring it out. I don't understand, said John. To hang yourself, you have to tie the rope around your neck, tie the other end to something that'll support your weight, and then jump off of something, cutting off your air, right? Amelia said. So where'd he jump from? John looked around the room, realizing his sister's observation was correct. Taru had been hung from nearly the middle of the room, and there was no ladder, no stool, and no chair. Not anything to stand on around him. Dear God, this is a murder, John said, suddenly horrified. Don't doubt my skills, Amelia said, folding up her glasses and tucking them away. She wandered around the room absent-mindedly, never looking at Sherlock. She knew she was a prime suspect at the moment. She'd been able to point out the facts that the others had overlooked. She fit the criteria well, and she threatened to kill someone. We need to figure out who killed him, Sherlock stated. Why? The bald man questioned. You're going to make sure your girlfriend ain't the killer? She's a pretty and in it. She got a bit of an attitude, though. Not sure how I like it. What's your name? Amelia asked him, quivering with rage. Eric. Me name's, he answered, cut off by Amelia grabbing the collar of his shirt. She kneed him in the groin, followed by an uppercut to his face. She took a step back and performed a roundhouse kick. Her sole of her Oxford booties and its wooden heel landing perfectly in Eric's sternum, throwing him back a few feet, his body collapsing underneath him. She placed her foot on Eric's chest, keeping him down as he weakly lifted his head. She leaned down to his level, looking him in the eyes. Would you like me to tell your wife that you've been cheating on her with... She glanced around the room, looking at a 20-something-ish woman. Your secretary? Sherlock shook his head. I thought not. Now get Fumiaka's body and move to St. Bard's morgue. We'll deal with it from there, Amelia huffed, stepping off of Eric's chest, turning on her heel and starting to leave. You should watch out, you know, Eric called after her. You made a fair bit of enemies, Miss Watson. You never know when they'll turn out to be your friends. Moriarty wanted me to tell you. Apparently, you're part of his game. Amelia hesitated in the doorframe. She let out a dark laugh, something none of them were expecting to hear. She turned and looked over her shoulder at Eric. Well, tell Marty that he's going to lose. How can you be so sure of that? Eric questioned. Because he lacks conviction, Amelia answered quickly, striding away. A few months later at 221B. Amelia, John, and Sherlock had just returned from their weekly groceries as John was apparently incapable of going alone, and were sitting about unpacking. As per usual, Sherlock had run up ahead of the Watsons, insisting he didn't have enough time to dawdle. So, John began as he and his sister climbed the stairs. You and Sherlock, huh? Amelia shot him a glare. Shut up, John. It's none of your business. Well, John continued, if you two get married, I'll be the brother-in-law to my best friend. Amelia punched him in the shoulder with her free hand. Jesus, woman. He rubbed his now sore arm and walked into the kitchen, setting the bags down on the table. Sherlock, Amelia said warningly as she slowly walked over Sherlock, who was standing by their bedroom, reminding Sherlock that he had to help unpack. You have a client, Sherlock said softly. Amelia peeking around his side, stiffening when she saw who was in the bedroom. What, in your bedroom? John exclaimed. He set down the carton of eggs he'd been carrying and hurried over to Sherlock. He stepped into the bedroom, his mouth dropping. Oh, he drawled. Oh, is right, Amelia agreed, as the trio all focused their gazes on the bed, as the woman laying there was none other than the woman. Chapter 27. The Wheel Turns. Amelia sighed, running a hand through her hair, then massaging the back of her neck. Well, she said, here goes nothing. She snatched a pillow off the bed and repeatedly hit Irene in the face with it. Get up, we don't have all day. Irene moaned, her eyes fluttering open. Amelia pointed down the corridor to the bathroom. Go shower, you stink. Then we can talk. Everything you need is in there. Irene sputtered, grumbling insults as she reluctantly got up, moving to the bathroom. Amelia looked down at the pillow still held in her hand, lightly hitting Sherlock over the head with it. She let out a giggle as he glared at her. What? She said, feigning innocence. Her eyes suddenly widened in realization, running out of the room as she said, The ice cream's still on the table. What? John said, not understanding. You can't leave the ice cream on the table, you idiot, Amelia said, taking the pralines and cream-flavored desserts and grabbing a spoon. It'll melt. She opened the container and scooped a bite-sized piece. She bit into it, moaning in pleasure. Dear God, that is amazing. So, Sherlock said after Irene had showered, who's after you? People who want to kill me, Irene answered, looking around the living room of the flat. Amelia was curled up on her seat, eating her ice cream like the boys sat at the table looking at her. Who's that? Amelia asked. Killers, Irene said simply. It would help if you were a tiny bit more specific, she muttered in reply, rolling her eyes slightly and continuing to eat her frozen dairy product. So you faked your own death in order to get ahead of them, Sherlock realized. It worked for a while, Irene said with a shrug. Except you let John know that you're alive, and therefore me, Amelia realized. And by doing so, you also let Sherlock know. I knew you two would keep my secret, Irene said nonchalantly. You couldn't, Sherlock said pointedly. Amelia let out a small scuff at his passing remark. He noticed that Amelia was slowly growing more reserved, hiding her other emotions under sarcasm, and not even he could get her to talk. But you did, didn't you? Irene said with a smirk, glancing around the living room once again. Where's my camera phone? It's not here, said John with a look of contempt. We're not stupid. Then what have you done with it? Irene questioned. If they've guessed you've got it, they'll be watching you. If they've been watching me, Amelia said, forming an intricate alibi, they'll know that Sherlock and I took a safety deposit box at the bank on the Strand a few months ago. I need it, Irene said insistently. Well, Amelia said with a winning smile, we can't just go and get it, can we? Molly Hooper, John said out of the blue, suddenly inspired. She could collect it, take it to Bart's, then one of your homeless network could bring it here, leave it in the cafe, and one of the boys downstairs could bring it up the back. Very good, John, Sherlock said with a smile. Excellent plan, with intelligent precautions. Thank you, John said, picking up the phone to call for Molly. So why don't... He trailed off, seeing Sherlock reach into his jean pockets, retrieving the camera phone and holding it up. So what do you keep on here, in general, I mean? Sherlock asked, as Irene stood, a hungry shine in her eyes. Pictures, information, anything I might find useful, Irene said. What, for blackmail? John guessed with a raised brow. For protection, Irene said with a coy smile. I make my way in the world. I misbehave. I like to know people will be on my side, exactly when I need them to be. Amelia cleared her throat. So, how do you acquire this information? She said around a mouthful of ice cream. I told you. I misbehave, Irene said suggestively, her eyes flicking to Amelia. Sorry, hun, but I don't roll that way, Amelia said, flashing a smile at Irene. Amelia set her ice cream down to the side, having finished a small container already. But you've acquired something that's more dangerous than protection. Do you know what that is? Yes, said Irene, but I don't understand it. I assume, Sherlock said. Show me. As Irene held her hand out for her phone, Sherlock kept it just out of reach. The passcode? Irene blinked lazily, defying Sherlock. Sherlock, just, Amelia said softly, taking the phone from Sherlock and handing it to Irene, who typed in 4 characters, angling the phone so none of them could see. It's not working, Irene said in frustration as the phone buzzed, rejecting her password. No, because it's a duplicate that I had made, Sherlock said, standing and taking the phone from Irene's hand, into which you've just answered the numbers 1058. He walked to his chair where Irene had been sitting moments before, retrieving the real camera phone from where he hid it under the cushion. I've assumed you'd choose something more specific than that, but, thanks anyways. He pulled up the lock screen, typing in, I am 1058 locked. He smiled smugly, but, once again, the phone beeped warningly. A message reading, wrong passcode, 1 attempt remaining, showing up on the screen. Sherlock stared at the screen in disbelief, utterly shocked that he had gotten it wrong. I told you that camera phone was my life, Irene said with a smirk. I know when it's in my hand. Oh, you're rather good, Sherlock complimented. Irene smiled at him. You're not so bad. She held out her hand again, taking the phone from Sherlock. Amelia rolled her eyes as Irene looked Sherlock up and down, too tired to care about Irene Adler, of all people, flirting with her boyfriend. Hamish, John said abruptly, uncomfortable at how Irene was looking at Sherlock. Amelia started as both Irene and Sherlock turned to him. John Hamish Watson, if you were looking for baby names. Sherlock frowned in confusion, not understanding John's hidden meaning. There is a man, an MOD official, Irene said, sauntering away from the trio so they wouldn't be able to see her passcode as she typed it in. I knew what he liked. She pulled up a photo, showing it to the group. One of the things he liked was showing off. He told me this email was going to save the world. He didn't know it, but I photographed it. He handed it to Sherlock, Amelia immediately peeking over her shoulder to read the email. He was a bit tied up at the time. It's a bit small on that screen. Can you read it? Sherlock sat down at the table. He showed it to Amelia, recalling that she was both a field agent and the National Security Advisor. She shook her head no, answering his silent question. I don't think so. It looks familiar. She narrowed her eyes at the photo of the email. Subject, 007 confirmed allocation. Then in the body, typed in smaller letters, 4C12C4F13E1360B C1F34G34J D0D12H33K34K. Yes, Sherlock said to Irene. A code, obviously, she said almost tiredly. I had one of the best cryptographers in the country take a look at it, though he was mostly upside down, as I recall. Couldn't figure it out. As Sherlock led forward, examining the screen, Irene continued on. What can you do, Mr. Holmes? Go on. Impress the girl. Why? Sherlock said slowly. Why would I help you? Don't do it for me, Irene said in a low, seductive tone. Do it for Amelia over there. There was a soft click of a gun and a muzzle pressed into the small of Amelia's back. I won't kill her, but it'll definitely hurt, Amelia whispered in Sherlock's ear. John, completely unaware of the situation happening across the table from him. Time slowed down for Sherlock as Irene leaned in to kiss his cheek, while John lowered the mug he'd been drinking tea from. The code ran through Sherlock's mind quickly, his desperation fueling him. Before Amelia had even blinked, and just as John lowered his mug while Irene finished kissing Sherlock, he'd already solved it. Sherlock let out a breath as Irene lowered the gun she'd aimed at Amelia, rapidly saying, There's a margin for error, but I'm probably sure there's a 747 leaving Hearth Road tomorrow at 6:30 in the evening for Baltimore. Apparently it's going to save the world, but not sure how that can be true, but given a moment, I've only been on this case for 8 seconds. He looked around at Irene, John, and Amelia, who was completely unfazed by her near shouting. Oh, come on, Sherlock groaned. It's not a code. These are seat allocations on a passenger jet. Look, there's no letter I because it's been mistaken for a 1. No letters past K. The width of the plane is the limit. The numbers always appear randomly and not in the sequence, but the letters have little runs of sequences all over the place, families and couples sitting together. Only a jumbo is wide enough to need the letter K, and rows past 55, which is why there's always an upstairs. There's a row 13, which eliminates the more superstitious airlines. Then there's the style of the flight number 007 that eliminates a few more. And assuming a British point of origin, which would be illogical considering the original source of the information, and assuming the increased pressure of you lately that the crisis is imminent. The only flight that matches all the criteria and departs within the week is the 6:30 to Baltimore tomorrow evening from Heathrow Airport. Please don't feel obliged to tell me that was remarkable or amazing. Jones expressed the same thought in every possible variant available to the English language. He let out a breath, realizing he was now standing. I would have you right here on the desk until you begged for mercy twice, Irene said intensely. John, please, can you check those flight schedules, see if he's right, Amelia said, trying to avoid looking at Irene and Sherlock at all cost. Uh-huh, John said, the tension in the air so thick he could cut it with a knife. I'm on it, yeah. I've never begged for mercy in my life, Sherlock said as John searched for the flight. Twice, Irene said coyly. Yeah, John said, his eyes still on the screen. He's right, flight 007. Amelia blanched, all cover draining her face. What did you say? She asked in a hoarse whisper, briefly looking up to Sherlock, whose eyes were now wide and maniac. He's right, John repeated. No. After that, Amelia said hurriedly, hoping she'd heard wrong. What did you say at that? 007, John said quizzically. Flight 007. 007, 007, 007, 007, Amelia muttered repeatedly, pushing Irene out of her way as she began to pace frantically, trying to recall where she'd heard that recently. Something connected to 007. What? Sherlock's eyes followed her, apparently thinking the same thing, but not moving. Amelia cursed under her breath, walking over to the double mirror on the mantelpiece. Her eyes closed in thought. 007, she murmured. 007. What? Something, what? None of them noticed Irene sending a message which read 747, 6:30 p.m. Heathrow to an unidentified number. Her eyes flew open, Mycroft's voice running through her thoughts. Bond air is go. Bond air is go. Bond air is go. Check with the Controversy lot. Amelia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She spun around wildly, her hair flying around her head like a cloud. Fucking hell. She grabbed her coat, sprinting out of the flat, hailing a cab and driving off. Sherlock, John, and Irene stared after her, a mysterious smile on Irene's blood-red lips. All Irene knew was the message she'd sent, more specifically, the person she sent it to, was going to make Mycroft Holmes in Amelia Watson's life a living hell. Several hours later, 221B. Have you ever had anyone? Irene asked Sherlock, glad that John had gone out just after his sister had, though probably not to the same place. Sorry, Sherlock said blankly. And when I say had, Irene continued on, I'm being indelicate. I don't understand. Well, I'll be delicate, then. Irene got up, kneeling in front of Sherlock and placing her left hand on top of his right. Let's have dinner, Irene proposed. Why? Might be hungry, Irene said nonchalantly. I'm not. Good, Irene said with a smile. Sherlock leaned forward, curling his fingers around her wrist, and as he took her pulse. Why would I want to have dinner if I wasn't hungry? Oh, Mr. Holmes, Irene said softly, not noticing Sherlock's actions. If it was the end of the world, if this was the very last night, would you have dinner with me? Sherlock, Amelia yelled from downstairs, apparently having arrived. Too late, Irene said ruefully as Sherlock's eyes flickered to the door, realizing she'd already lost his attention. That's not the end of the world, that's Amelia, Sherlock said as Irene pulled her hand free from his, standing and walking away from the consulting detective. Sherlock, this man was at the door. Is the bell still not working? Amelia said sharply, coming in with the guard who'd led Sherlock to Buckingham Palace. She turned to him. He shot it. Have you come to take me away again? Sherlock said tenaciously to the guard. Again? You've met Plummer before? Amelia said, sounding surprised. Yes, Mr. Holmes, Plummer confirmed. Well, I decline, Sherlock said dismissively. I don't think you do, Amelia said sternly, reaching into the inside pocket of Sherlock's blazer, which she was wearing, and throwing a white envelope at Sherlock. Inside sat 2 business-class boarding passes for Flyaway Airways with Amelia and Sherlock's names on them for Flight 007 to Baltimore, scheduled to leave at 18:30. Sherlock looked up at Amelia, utterly baffled. I don't care if you still decline, because either way I'm dragging you with, Amelia said, tossing Sherlock's coat at him. I'll be in the car, and you, she turned to Irene, Stay out of trouble, or I'll hunt you down myself. Me? Irene said, blinking. Trouble? Amelia snorted. Let's have dinner, she mocked, her voice growing unnaturally high. Don't think I didn't hear you. Amy, Sherlock started. I don't care, Sherlock, Amelia spat. Sherlock stiffening at the sound of his full name. She never called him Sherlock if she could avoid it. I don't care if you've been flirting with other women behind my back, because right now, I really don't give a damn. What I care about is that if it weren't for Mycroft vouching for the trickiness of this one, she pointed at Irene, I'd be out of a job right now. So, get downstairs in the car before I shove her bloody camera phone so far up your fat arse that you won't be able to speak. Got it? Everyone turned to stare at Amelia during her outburst, but she waved them off with a dignified huff, storming down the stairs. Moody, Irene mumbled. Sherlock shot her a glare, pulling on his coat and following Amelia down the stairs. He slid into the back seat beside Amelia, sighing when she pressed herself as much as she could to the door. There's going to be a bomb on a passenger jet, Sherlock said, part way through the ride, taking out the plane ticket. The British and American governments know about it, but rather than expose the source of that information, they're going to let it happen. The plane will blow up. Coventry all over again. The wheels turn. Nothing is ever new. No one responded to him, save for the hateful glare Amelia shot his way. Chapter 27, Destructive Beauty. Later, Heathrow Airport. Well, you're looking all better, Sherlock said in a fake American accent as he stepped out of the car, his eyes falling upon Nielsen, who stood before the jumbo jet. How are you feeling? Like putting a bullet in your brain, sir, Amelia said. Nielsen said, Amelia letting out a quiet laugh as she walked up the stairs. They'd pin a medal on me if I did, sir. And if you do it right now, I'll be the one who'd give it to you, Amelia said. Amy, Sherlock began in exasperation. Just don't, Amelia said softly. Amy, please. Amelia stepped on Sherlock's foot, deliberately putting on her weight onto the back of her foot, jamming the heel into the top of Sherlock's foot. She huffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder as she quickly hurried into the plane. Sherlock followed after her, stepping into the plane. He pulled back the curtain, which kept the business class seated hidden from the view. He looked around the plane at the people sitting in almost all the seats, realizing that none of them were moving, talking, or even blinking. Somewhere between the door and the seats, Amelia had disappeared in the shadows, purposely avoiding Sherlock. Sherlock tried to ignore the pang of guilt and pain that shot through his heart, choosing to focus on why he'd been summoned here. He examined the people, realizing they were all dead, their skin gray and started to smell, although the frigid air of the plane kept them from starting to the decomposition process. The contrary conundrum, Mycroft's voice said from out of the blue, stepping into the cabin with Amelia trailing behind him. What do you think of my solution? Sherlock glared around the cabin, taking in the ingenious idea. The flight of the dead, Amelia said softly. The plane blows up mid-air, Sherlock realized. Mission accomplished for the terrorists. 100 of casualties, but nobody dies. Neat, don't you think? Mycroft said as Sherlock smiled humorously. You've been stumbling around the fringes of this one for ages, or were you too bored to notice the pattern? We ran a similar project with the Germans a while back, though I believe one of our passengers didn't make the flight. But that was the deceased for you. Late in every sense of the word. How's the plane going to fly? Sherlock asked, the answer popping into his head almost immediately. Of course, unmanned aircraft, hardly new. It doesn't fly, said Amelia. It will never fly. This entire project is cancelled. The terrorist cell has been informed that we know about the bomb. We can't fool them now. We've lost everything. One fragment of one email, and months and years of planning finished. You're a MOD man, Sherlock accused, turning to Mycroft. That's all it takes, Mycroft said, looking to Sherlock, then to Amelia. One lonely, naive man, desperate to show off, and a woman clever enough to make him feel special. Sherlock mused. You should screen your defense people more carefully. I'm not talking about the MOD man, Sherlock, Amelia said, her voice rising to a furious shout. I'm talking about you. The damsel in distress, Mycroft exclaimed to a confused-looking Sherlock. Mycroft's eyes briefly flicked to Amelia. In the end, are you really so obvious? Because this was textbook. The promise of love, the pain of loss, the joy of redemption. Then give him a puzzle and watch him dance. Don't be absurd, Sherlock said quickly. Absurd? Mycroft said in disbelief. How quickly did you decipher that email for her? Was it the full minute, or were you really eager to impress? I think it was less than 5 seconds, Irene said from behind Sherlock, her hair pulled up in an intricate knot atop her head and wearing an immaculate dress. I usually keep up with my threats, Amelia said, glancing at Sherlock, but I think instead of hurting you, I'll just kill her. Behave, Mycroft scolded. Why should I? Amelia hissed. This woman's made my life hell, Mycroft. There are innocent people dying halfway around the world, and one of the few people who actually deserves to die is standing in front of us, very much alive. Nudging Amelia in the ribs, Mycroft continued on, talking about how both Irene and Amelia. I drove you into her path. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Mr. Holmes, I think we need to talk, Irene said. So do I, Sherlock agreed. There's a number of aspects I'm still not clear on. Not you, Junior, Irene said as she walked past Sherlock. You're done now. She held up her camera phone, showing it to Mycroft. There's more. Loads more. On this phone that I've got secrets, pictures, and scandals that could topple your whole world. You have no idea how much I can cause, and actually one way to stop me, unless you want to tell your masters that your biggest security leak is your own little brother and his troublesome girlfriend. Keep your friends close, my dear, and your enemies closer, Moriarty's voice said in Amelia's head, almost singing the phrase. It had taken her a while, but she finally understood. Moriarty didn't want her dead, as proved by his warning that Irene would turn against her and her friends. No, Moriarty wanted her alive. He'd always had a flair for the dramatics, and right now he wanted her to watch. He wasn't going to burn the heart out of Sherlock. It was Amelia's heart he was after, and he'd do it by crumbling her world around her. The sitting room in one of Mycroft's houses, 30 minutes later. Mycroft sat at the dining table with Irene Adler directly across from him when Sherlock and Amelia sat before the fireplace, neither acknowledging the presence of the other. Mycroft had to admit that bringing the two extraordinary brilliant women and Sherlock together would be one of the worst decisions he'd ever made. Mycroft understood why Sherlock was so attracted to Amelia Watson. There had even been a brief point in time where Mycroft had wondered if it would be like what it would be like to be in a relationship with her. But it was no surprise that his brother and the youngest Watson had gotten together. But Mycroft had never accounted for the attraction Sherlock felt for the promiscuous Irene Adler. Amelia stared into the fireplace without blinking, the flickering orange light making her gray eyes appear to be amber that had not yet solidified. The colors ever changing and swirling within themselves. Her black painted nails clenched the arms of her chair, digging into the fabric. She could feel Sherlock's eyes on her, but she chose to ignore it, focusing in on Mycroft and Irene's conversation. We have people who can get into this, said Mycroft calmly, though his thoughts raced with violent ways he could get back at Sherlock and Irene. Sherlock's naivety had led the four of them to this point, that and the fact that Amelia had not been informed of Mycroft's plans. I tested that theory for you, Irene replied sweetly. I let Sherlock Holmes try it for 6 months. Sherlock, dear, tell him what you found when you x-rayed my camera phone. There are 4 additional units wired inside the casing, Sherlock said, his voice lacking any emotion, save for the pain he felt at betraying Amelia when he hid under a collected mask of indifference. I suspect containing acid or a small amount of explosive. Any attempt to open the casing will burn the hard drive, Amelia said quietly, Mycroft holding his head in his hands tiredly. Explosive, Irene said to Mycroft. It's more me. Mycroft lifted his head. Some data is always recoverable. Take that risk, Irene said, fully knowing that it'd be unlikely that he'd go through with it. You have a passcode to open this, Mycroft said. I deeply regret to say we have people who can extract it from you. His eyes briefly flickering to Amelia, who only stiffened in her chair, both enjoying the concept of torturing Irene and hating it at the same time. Mycroft knew that Amelia's time with Moriarty had given her very persuasive and creative methods of extracting information. Sherlock, Irene said. There will be 2 passcodes, Sherlock said. 1 to open the phone, 1 to burn the drive. Even under duress, you can't know which one she's given you, and there will be no point in the second attempt. He's good, isn't he? Irene remarked passively. I should have him on a leash. In fact, I might. Touch him, Amelia hissed, her eyes threatening, flickering up to Irene. I dare you. Amelia looked to Sherlock, immediately looking away when his gaze met her own. It wasn't that she despised Sherlock at the moment, although she currently wasn't happy with him. It was that she never wanted her past to catch up to her. More specifically, she never wanted him to see her this broken. Amelia had never truly healed from her encounters with Moriarty. She thought she had finally escaped him, only to have him hold a gun to her head and threaten her brother and Sherlock. Moriarty was slowly winning over Amelia. Each day he picked at her, chipping away at her very being. "Will you destroy this, then?" Mycroft said. "No one has the information." "Fine," Irene said nonchalantly. "Good idea. Unless there are lives of British citizens depending on the information you're about to burn." "Are there?" Mycroft questioned. "Telling you would be playing fair. I'm not playing any more," Irene said with an almost proud smile. She reached into her handbag, pulling out an envelope and sliding it across the table to Mycroft. "A list of my requests, and some ideas about my protection once they're granted. I'd say it wouldn't blow much of a hole in the wealth of the nation, but then I'd be lying." Mycroft unfolded the paper, raising his eyebrow at the demands Irene listed. "I imagine you'd like to sleep on it," Irene said. "Thank you, yes." "Too bad," Irene said. Sherlock snorting at her comment. Turning back to Mycroft, she said, "Off you pop and talk to people." "You've been very thorough," Mycroft said with a sigh. "I wish our lot were half as good as you. I do suppose we have Miss Watson." Amelia shot him a momentary glare, deciding not to exact revenge on Mycroft for his comment. "I'm not a pet," she murmured. "I can't take all the credit," Irene said. "Had a bit of help." She looked to Amelia. "Oh, and Jim Moriarty sends his love." "Yes, he's been in touch. Seems desperate for my attention," Amelia said in a low growl, as she stood and walked to Mycroft's side. "Which I'm sure can be arranged." "I had all this stuff," continued Irene. "Never knew what to do with it. Thank God for the consultant criminal. Gave me a lot of advice about how to play the home boys." "Do you know what he calls you?" he asked Mycroft and Sherlock. "The Iceman and the Virgin. And you, Amelia dear?" "What he calls you should not be said around children. Didn't even ask for anything. I think he just likes to cause trouble. Now that's my kind of man." "And here you are, the dominatrix who brought a nation to its knees," Mycroft said as Sherlock's eyes snapped open. Mycroft stood, nodding his head at Irene. "Nicely played." "No," Sherlock said, before Mycroft could leave the room to fulfill Irene's demands. Irene, Mycroft, and Amelia looked round at him, but Irene was the first to voice her thoughts. "Sorry?" "I said no," Sherlock said. "Very, very close, but no." He stood, walking towards Irene. "You got carried away. The game was too elaborate. You were enjoying yourself too much." "No such thing as too much," Irene said. "Oh?" Sherlock said, looking down at her. "Enjoying the thrill of the chase is fine. Craving the distraction of the game, I sympathize entirely. But sentiment? Sentiment is a chemical defect found in the losing side. Sentiment is a weakness ingrained in our nature, a weakness that can take over us before we realize its seeds have taken root. And I'm sure Miss Watson would be more than happy to explain." "Sentiment? What are you talking about?" Irene said in confusion. "You," Sherlock said simply, his eyes on Irene. "Oh, dear God," Irene said with a calm smile. "Look at the poor man. You don't actually think I was interested in you? Why, because you're the great Sherlock Holmes, the clever detective in the funny hat?" "No," Sherlock said softly, pressing himself against Irene, wrapping his hand around Irene's wrist. "Because I took your pulse. Elevated, your pupils dilated. I imagine John Watson loves the mystery to me, but the chemistry is incredibly simple and very destructive." Making his point, he looked at Amelia, who was silently standing by, her eyes on the ground. "I've seen its effects myself, and regret everything I ever did to get there." Amelia looked up at his confusion, shocked by his words. "When we first met," said Sherlock as he walked away from Irene, who followed him like a lost puppy, "you told me that disguise is always a self-portrait. How true of you! The combination to your safe, your measurements. But this," he tossed the phone in the air, tracing it once again. "This is far more intimate." He pulled the lock screen. "This is your heart." He punched the first character with a finger. "And you should never let it rule your head." He kept his eyes on her, seeing the panic in the cool, blue-gray color. "You could have chosen any random number and walked out of here today with everything you worked for." He punched in the second letter. "But you just couldn't resist it, could you?" He flashed a smile at Irene's breathing became heavy in her panic. "I've always assumed that love is a dangerous disadvantage." He punched in the third character. "Thank you for the final proof." "Everything I said. It's not real," Irene said softly, catching his hand before he could complete the passcode. "I was just playing the game." And look at what it cost you, Sherlock thought. But the two words that escaped her mouth were, "I know, and this is just losing." He typed in the last character, showing the phone to Irene, who now had tears trickling down her cheeks. "I am Sherlock." There you are, brother, Sherlock said to Mycroft, handing him the phone. I hope the contents make up for any inconvenience I may have caused you tonight. I'm certain they will, Amelia murmured as Mycroft gave the phone to her, looking up at Sherlock from under her long lashes. Thank you, sure. Her nickname for him now had new meaning, proof that sentiment was just as bad as if not worse than a weapon, proof of all they've gotten through together. If you're feeling kind, Sherlock said as he walked away. His heart swelling with happiness when he heard Amelia's forgiveness in her voice. Lock her up, or otherwise let her go. I doubt she'll survive long without her protection. He looked back at Amelia, especially not with her around. Are you expecting me to beg? Irene said. Before Sherlock could, Amelia flatly said, yes. Please, Irene begged as Amelia strode over to Sherlock, locking her hands with Sherlock's. Neither of them moved as Irene continued on. You're right. I won't even last 6 months. Sherlock turned back to her, feeling hatred for the woman who'd torn he and Amelia apart. Sorry about dinner, he turned sharply, walking out of the room, with Amelia clinging on to him. John ran down Baker Street, his coat held over his head to protect him from the rain, which had already drenched his stocky frame. He looked up to see Mycroft standing outside of Speedy's, smoking a cigarette with a clear plastic envelope tucked under his arm, with a briefcase by his feet. You don't smoke, John remarked, surprised by Mycroft's presence on Baker Street. I also don't frequent cafes, Mycroft replied, dropping his cigarette and snuffing it out with his heel, closing his umbrella. He picked up his briefcase, walking into Speedy, with John following. Mycroft sat at a table, John immediately taking the seat across from him. After John had ordered a coffee, Mycroft slid into the envelope with Irene's camera phone among various papers inside across the table to John. A sticker reading Restricted Access Confidential plastered across the front. This is the file on Irene Adler, John said, picking up his mug. Closed forever, Mycroft said. I'm about to go and inform my brother, or if you prefer, you are, that she somehow got herself into a witness protection scheme in America. New name, new identity. She will survive and thrive, but he will never see her again. Why would he care? John said, recalling how both Amelia and Sherlock refused to talk about Irene Adler. He despised her at the end. Won't even mention her by the name, just the woman. Is that loathing or a salute? Mycroft questioned. One of the kinds. The one woman who matters. He's not like that, John countered quickly. He doesn't feel things that way, I don't think. She damaged Amelia and Sherlock's relationship severely. I don't think either of them will let her live that down. Mycroft took in a sharp breath. My brother has the brains of a scientist or philosopher, yet he elects to be a detective. What might we deduce about his heart? I don't know. Neither do I. But initially he wanted to be a pirate. He'll be okay with the witness protection, John said after a moment pause. Never seeing you again, he'll be fine. I agree. That's why I decided to tell him that. Instead of what? John said, puzzled. She's dead, Mycroft said. She was captured by a terrorist cell in Karachi 2 months ago and beheaded. It's definitely her. She's done this before. I was thorough this time. It would take Sherlock Holmes and your sister's help to fool me, and I don't think they were on hand, do you? There was a long pause before Mycroft pushed the envelope towards John, clasping his hands and looking at the doctor. So, what should we tell Sherlock? 221B's kitchen. Clearly, you've got news, Amelia observed before John had even walked into the room. Hearing his footsteps, she looked over Sherlock's shoulder, peeking at his microscope. You twit! You said you had the slide crooked. It doesn't matter. It's still the same amoeba either way you look at it, Sherlock grumbled before clearing his throat and speaking to John. If it's about the Leeds triple murder, it was the gardener. Nobody noticed the earring. Hi, no, it's about Irene Adler, John said, stepping further into the kitchen. Oh, said Sherlock. Something happened. Had she come back? For her sake, I hope not, Amelia muttered. She and Sherlock had secretly traveled to Karachi under an alibi of a case, which, in a way, it was, to save Irene from her beheading. And although she'd been strongly against it, she even made sure that Irene would be and stay safe from the people who wished her dead. No, John said. I just bumped into Mycroft downstairs. He had to take a call. Is she back in London? Sherlock asked, walking around the table and to John. No, she's in America. America? Amelia said in fake shock, containing a snicker at his lying. She got herself on a witness protection scheme, apparently. Don't know how she swung it, but, well, you know, John trailed off, looking to Sherlock. I know what? The detective asked. Well, you won't be able to see her again, John said. Why would we want to see her again? Amelia said with an accusing raised brow. Didn't say you did, John said. Is that her file? Sherlock questioned, walking back around the table. Yes, I was just going to take it back to Mycroft. He offered the envelope to Sherlock. Do you want to? No. John mused. Listen, actually. Oh, Sherlock said suddenly. But I will have the camera phone, though. He held his hand out without looking up from the microscope, demanding Miss Adler's camera phone. There's nothing on it anymore. It's been stripped. I know, but I'll still have it, Sherlock said. I've got to give this back to Mycroft. You can't keep it, John exclaimed, trying not to roll his eyes as Sherlock kept his hand out. Sherlock, I have to give this to Mycroft. It's the government's now. I wouldn't even give... Please? For God's sake, Amelia said loudly. John Hamish Watson, on behalf of MI6, the Queen, Mycroft, and the British government, I give you permission to give William Sherlock Scott Holmes the camera phone that once belonged to Miss Irene Adler. Would you like the paperwork to go with it? She added the last part on sarcastically, giving John a smug look. Thank you, Sherlock said, as John shook his head, giving the detective the phone. Well, I better take this back, John said, lifting the envelope in the air. Yes, Amelia and Sherlock chorused. John started to walk away before turning back. Did she ever text you again after all that? Once, Sherlock answered, a few months ago. What did she say? John asked in interest. Sherlock shot a look to Amelia, who wandered over to the window, staring out at the rain outside. It was no surprise that her favorite weather was a thunderstorm, both equally as destructive and as beautiful as she was. Sherlock paused for a moment, opening his mouth to speak. He turned back to John. Then he said forlornly, as if Irene were a lover lost, Goodbye, Mr. Holmes.